Hello, and so today we are going to discuss communication. We're going to talk about some basics in communication. And first of all, I just want to welcome you to this discussion. And so, what I'm hoping to do today is to discuss some basic concepts about human communication, some basic essential things that cover human behavior. And before I get into that, though, I want to kind of preface what I'm going to be talking about when it comes to communication. So, the first thing I'm going to try to do today is to define the communication process for you. So, I'm going to try to define the process of communication for you. Then I want to look at some of the functions of communication. So, what do we use communication for? Now, at the very basic level, I should say, at the very basic level, I think we all know what we use communication for. So, what I'm going to try to do, though, is to show how important those things are and try to relate them to some very basic things that we would do on an everyday basis. Then, something else that I love talking about is what is quality communication, right? So, what does quality communication look like? And then, can you put a value on communication? Can you put a dollar value on communication? Or can you put some type of value to say it has a certain relationship to the way that you might have a really solid relationship with someone? So can we put a value on communication? Is there a value? And then we're going to look at a couple characteristics that I also think are important. We're also going to look at what communication scholars will consider to be competent communication and define what competent communication is. And then we'll also look at some different models and representations of communication. But what I want to do is I want to start with going back to the beginning, what is the purpose of communication, right? And why is communication so important to all of us? Well, for starters, we need to be able to communicate just to be able to relate to each other at a very basic level. So, for example, if you're trying to get your message across, all right, and when you start thinking of getting messages across, we're already thinking of communication when we start thinking of messages. And then obviously it depends on the type of message that you're trying to get across. That would have a lot to do with what model, perhaps not what model, but what mode of communication that we decide to use, right? And as I said, we're also going to look at the models, but what mode of communication that we decide to use that has a lot to do with the message that we're trying to transmit. So, we use communication to get along with, to attempt to get along with people. We use communication just to be able to, whether it's going to the store, going to the bank, being able to pick up the phone, whether it's sign language. But a lot of times, I think as we're on this, a lot of times people think that when they hear communication, they only think talking, right? So they only think about verbal communication. So personally, I do believe, and a lot of research does suggest as well, that most of the communication that we engage in is nonverbal communication. So it's not necessarily what we're saying, all right, but is our actions and a number of other things that encompass what nonverbal communication is. So let's kind of get into this material here and take a better look at it. So first thing I want to talk about is something that communication scholars will refer to as the functional perspective. And the functional perspective basically says that we use communication in relationships for three purposes, right? We use communication in relationships for three purposes. And so now we're looking at the role of the functional perspective. And one of those is to express affiliation. Now, if you think of what the word affiliation means, so just think about what the word affiliation means, and we know what it is to express. So the word affiliation means that we are connected to something or someone in some type of way, some form or fashion, or whatever the case is. And then now if I'm going to express that, then it means I'm going to do or say something to indicate to this person or indicate to the world or someone or whatever the case is that I have some kind of connection, some type of affiliation with this person. All right. So I'm going to do something to suggest that I have some type of affiliation, some type of connection with this person. So what are some things that we do? Well, for example, if you're attending a certain school, you might wear a t-shirt or a hoodie or something like that that has the name, the logo of the school, the college or the university of the high school or whatever the case is on that. That is perhaps a way, or it is an example of a way of you showing that you're affiliated with that school. If we're affiliated with someone in terms of where perhaps we're in a relationship with that person, well, in a verbal way, we might say something that will give an indication that we are in a relationship with that person. So the way we refer to the person, right, will indicate that we have perhaps a certain type of relationship with that person. So you might refer to them as boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife or partner or whatever the case is, to give an indication of the type of relationship you might have with that person. Now, if in the case of someone being married, then they might wear a ring, right? So the ring would be the indication that we are affiliated with that person. Now, there's sometimes that we might do things to indicate that we're affiliated with something or someone, and we're really not, at least not to the extent that someone might think we are. So there is usually, there's a saying, you could be guilty by association, right? And so, my grandmother used to tell us that, when the cops show up, if you are in the wrong place at the wrong time or whatever the case is, that you could be, it might be looked at in such a way that you're participating in whatever is going on simply because maybe you're hanging out with the wrong people. And so affiliation sometimes could be misunderstood. Sometimes we don't think we're giving off, what I love to say, a certain type of vibe just by the way we are carrying ourselves or doing something or whatever the case is. Now that could lead to a whole lot of discussion in terms of how we could misappropriate things or misunderstand things, and how biases might play a role also in understanding someone's affiliation to something. And we'll get to that later on, maybe not in this discussion, but in a subsequent video. So the functional perspective says that we use communication in three ways. Again, the first one is to express affiliation. The second one is to achieve goals. Well, think about how you achieve your goal, right? Let's think of getting a job. And to be able to get that job, we've got to communicate verbally and non-verbally. So non-verbally, we communicate in terms of we've filled out the application online, we've put together hopefully a really good resume and a cover letter, and we have to proofread those, right? And so we submit those words and they look at them. And then non-verbally also when we show up for the interview. So let's say we've got the interview, we show up for the interview. Now, how do you dress? How do we dress for that interview? How do we carry ourselves for that interview? That has a lot to do with whether or not we achieve the goal. And remember, the goal is to get the job, right? So now that we're in the interview, let's say we dress well, we're looking well, the resume's good, it's on good paper. And another nonverbal is it's on good quote-unquote resume paper, and it's not coffee or juice or whatever is spilt on it if you took a couple copies with you to the resume, which is what, to the interview, which is what a lot of people a lot of times would recommend. And so the third part of the functional perspective says to influence others. Now, if the goal is to get a job, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to influence the people who are interviewing us. Let's say, for example, it's a panel of people that is conducting the interview. So we're now trying to influence these people in the interview, the interviewers, to say that I am the best person for the job. So how do you do that? How do you let them know that you're the best person for the job? Well, it has a lot to do with your resume. It has a lot to do with the way you carry yourself, the way you sit, the way you make eye contact, and we'll talk about eye contact and all that in terms of whether or not that's appropriate in a subsequent discussion, because in some cultures too much eye contact means you're challenging someone or whatever the case is. But let's say this is happening in a Western culture like the US or Canada or something like that. And so the goal is to influence, right? So the functional perspective says we use communication primarily in three ways: to express our affiliation to something or someone, to achieve goals. And so think of what you've got to do to achieve goals. You've got to be able to communicate. You've got to be able to talk to people, right? And then obviously the way in which we carry ourselves and the way in which we discuss something will have a lot to do with whether or not then we might be able to influence this person to achieve whatever goal it is that we're trying to achieve. All right, let's move on. So one of the characteristics of communication is that it is symbolic, right? So it's symbolic. So think of the word symbolism or the word symbolic and what that means. So symbolic is that something stands for something, right? Symbolism, right? It means something, right? So communication means something. So the way you communicate means something. So the way you talk to someone could be an indicator of something, or the way you don't talk to them could be an indicator of something. Your very silence could be an indicator of something, right? And so both language and behavior are symbols. Now, one of the examples I always use as something that's symbolic is, how would I know you are American if you won't, quote unquote, maybe wearing it and say you have a t-shirt that says I'm proud American or I'm proud whatever the case is type of stuff. Then when you open your mouth to speak, that is when I would know whether or not you are American, because I can hear your accent. See, that gets back to the whole idea of symbolic and symbolism. When you start speaking your language, your dialect, the way you would pronounce words or the way you would say certain things, I'll be able to say, well, oh yeah, this person is American. So, for example, I was in England a couple years ago, and I was in a department store, and you know, everyone's walking around, and then all of a sudden I heard these ladies on an escalator going upstairs in the store, and from the time I heard them speak, I was able to say, oh yeah, they are from the United States of America. And so that led to a conversation because, again, that symbolic gesture, me hearing them, hearing their accent, understanding what that symbolism meant, that I might have something in common with them because we both live in the same country, right? So that it's an identifier, right? Something that's symbolic, you can look at it as an identifier. It helps you to identify who someone is or perhaps who they are not. So symbolism is both language and behavior, right? The way you carry yourself. Going back again to the interview, do you dress like you're trying to get the job, or that maybe you dress in a way that indicates that you're not interested in the job? So communication requires, the second thing here is as far as characteristics is concerned, communication requires a shared code. Now, for us to be able to understand each other, we've got to be on, quote unquote, the same page. So we've got to be on the same page if we're going to understand each other, right? So it requires a shared code. Now, I love to use the example of dog. Now, in the US, the word dog, besides it being an animal or whatever the case is used, all right, sometimes people use that in a way to identify someone who's a friend, right? So they'll refer to that person using that word. Now, referring to someone from another culture, but in that same manner, could mean that you're putting the person down. In some cultures, if you refer to someone as a dog, it's kind of like you're talking about them like they don't really mean much, right? But symbolically, right? Remember symbolism. Symbolically, a dog in some cultures there's an elevation of the dog. So when you refer to someone, depending on the context of the situation, right? When you refer to someone in a certain way, you say that person is your dog or whatever the case is, then it has a different, again, a lot of this has to do with connotation and context and all that type of stuff, right? But it can have that different meaning. So We have to have a shared code. I also use the example of love. Now, what does love means? What does love mean? Now, it means different things depending on who you're talking to. And so, if I see love a different way, and you see love a completely different way, and we don't have a certain middle ground, right? This is where communication comes in, so we can have a conversation about what love is. We can have a lot of arguments, right? If you're in a relationship with someone and you're talking about love. So it requires a shared code. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to see love exactly alike, right? Doesn't mean we're going to see it exactly alike, but do we have some kind of similarity in the way that we look at the word love? So let's use the word, let's go back to dog as well. So when we construct a message, it's called encoding, all right? Anytime we engage in the construction of a message, you're putting together something to say, and as you're saying it, as you're constructing it, and you're getting those words out to the person, right? Whether it is by text messaging or whether it is in a telephone conversation or a face-to-face conversation, it is called encoding. That's the construction of the message. Now, when the person receives the message, they're going to try to decode that message. The decoding part of it, right? Anytime we engage in decoding, it means that we're trying to interpret what the other person is saying, right? So we're trying to interpret what that person is saying anytime we engage in the decoding process. So to encode is to create a message, right? So when you start talking to someone and you're trying to tell them something, you are encoding, you're creating a message, you're trying to get your point across. Communication is taking place. And then when the person, as a person is, or persons, as they are there now listening to you, or he or she is listening to you, and they're trying to interpret and make sense of whatever it is you're saying, then they are engaging in a process called decoding, which is to break down, to try to figure out whatever it is you're saying to them. So that's the second part, right? Second characteristic of communication, right? So moving on. Now, communication is linked to culture, as you could well imagine. And culture is typically defined as a large group of people who share similar beliefs and values and norms, perhaps language as well, also practices and stuff like that. They speak a similar language, maybe a slightly different dialect. Again, as the example of the US, it is generally, you can tell this person is from America, but they might have a different slightly way of pronouncing certain words depending on if they're from the South or the East Coast or the West Coast or whatever the case is. But so culture is typically, a large group of people sharing these values, these practices, beliefs, languages, and so on, right? So if you could understand now how we start to develop now our sense of who we are from culture, right? We're born into a culture. We're born into seeing things taking place in a certain type of way. And that's why they say no one is born a racist or no one is born hating people or whatever the case is. But we learn those things through culture. And the first culture that we're exposed to is the culture at home. And I'll try to get into that. Maybe not in this particular discussion, but I want to leave that for a little bit later on. All right, the next characteristic is that communication sometimes doesn't need to be intentional. So you might be giving off a certain vibe, and you're not aware of the fact that someone or people might be reading you a certain way based on the vibe that you're giving off. And so sometimes that's considered to be spontaneous or unintentional, right? It's unintentional. So someone looks at you and they say, "Why are you so mad? Like, why are you so mad? Why do you look so mad?" And you're not even aware that your facial expression is coming off as someone who might not be happy, someone who's upset or whatever the case is. And you're not aware of that. And so that is one of those intentional things about our body movements that we might not be aware of. We might not be aware of, we do some things with our hands, we're playing with our hair, or whatever the case is. And so we've got to be mindful of that. So sometimes some of the things we do are not intentional. Sometimes we might be wearing a certain type of clothing or whatever the case is and giving off a certain vibe, and it might not be intentional. But people might think it is intentional though, right? People might think it's intentional. So sometimes communication need not be intentional. In other words, you might get a message across that you do not intend to get across to people, but you are doing something or saying something or whatever the case is that is giving the very said message that you're not trying to portray. And so that's why we always have to be mindful of what we're saying and what we're doing when we're engaging in communication. So if you're in a relationship and someone is talking to you and they said to you, "Are you listening?" You're listening. Say, "I'm listening," but you're on your phone. But I'm listening, but you're on your phone. But you're giving off the communication or the message that you might be giving off is, well, whatever you're saying is not as important, but I'm listening, but are you really listening, right? And that's something else we're going to discuss as well as we move on. All right. Okay, so let's move on to a couple more characteristics. Now, communication occurs through various channels. Now, a channel is just how you're going to get your message from point A to point B. And that could be face-to-face, that could be emails, that could be books, that could be radio, that could be text messages. What channel are you going to use to get your message from point A to point B? Now, common sense would tell us that the channel you use might depend on a couple of things, right? How serious is the message? Is this something that I need to be in front of you to have that discussion with you because it's something that is so serious, so we need to be face to face? Is it something to where I can send you a text message and the text message is okay? Well, if I send a text message, remember, I don't have control over a couple of things. I don't know when you're going to look at it, and if you look at it, I don't know when you're going to respond because you're not right in front of me, right? And then you could very well see the text message and not respond till an hour after or whatever, because maybe I didn't express urgency in wanting a response from you when I sent you that text message. So a book obviously is something that it has a message in it, we're communicating in it, and that's something that people would read on their own unless you've been told that you need to read whatever chapter, whatever the case is. And there are many more channels that we could use to get our points across, to get our message across. So I will decide what channel I use depending on how fast do I want a response from you. If it's something that I need a really fast response from you, and we're not in the same location, I'm probably going to call you. I'm probably not going to text, right? If it's something that, well, it's kind of urgent, but I don't need it like right now, then maybe I'll send a text message, right? And then keep in mind when we use certain mediums, like a text message or whatever the case is, then in a text message, we're not able to hear the person's voice. And tone of voice is really important in terms of conveying a message. How important is it to you? Are you able to express empathy in a text message, right? Maybe if you know the person really well, they can pick up on empathy in a text message that you're sending him. Or is it that you need for the person to hear your voice, to know the seriousness of it, of what you're trying to say, of the message that you're trying to get across from that person? So a lot of things depend, there are a lot of factors that play into why we use a certain type of channel. Now, communication is considered to be a transactional process. There are two or more people involved. Typically, they're referred to in the communication world as the sender and the receiver, right? So you have the person who's sending the message. Remember, the sender is creating the message, which is referred to as the encoding of the message, and the receiver decodes the message, and that person's trying to understand what is in the content, or the context and the content of that message. All right, so let's move on. So let's take a look now at competent communication. Competent communication is considered to be process-oriented, right? So Process oriented means, let's say for example, it's focused on optimizing the outcome. So to optimize, I'm trying to get the best outcome, right? Trying to optimize the outcome for both partners, both people engaged in the transaction, right? Remember, it's a transactional process, communication between two or more people. So we're trying to optimize the outcome, right, between both partners so that there's some type of mutual satisfaction, at the end of the day in terms of the goal that we're trying to achieve. So if I am an interviewer, I am going to try to ask questions that will hopefully provoke the answers that I'm looking for to try to see if you are the best candidate for the job, right? If I am the interviewee who's trying to get the job, I am going to listen carefully to those questions that I'm asked, and I'm hopefully going to respond in such a way that I'm going to be able to give you the best answers that you then will be able to make a decision knowing that I am then seeing me or viewing me as the best candidate for the position. So both parties are engaged in trying to get that goal, that mutual satisfaction. At the end of the interview, I am comfortable in the fact that I ask you questions to figure out if you're the best candidate. And then I answered in the best way possible to prove that I am the best candidate. Now, if we stick with the interview format, one of the other things about the process in as far as competent communication is concerned, on the process oriented, is we're looking at the whole idea of values and ethical standards. Now, the interviewer has to have the ethics and the values in terms of they're asking me questions that are perhaps not illegal, not asking me questions that are going to be considered discriminatory unless they're BFOQs or whatever, and that's for a completely different discussion. But not asking me things that will be completely unethical questions, right? Not putting questions to me that they know they're not supposed to be asking me in an interview. Stuff that would lead to us going to HR probably. And then I have to be able to respond in such a way that is honest, right? The information on my resume is honest, and my responses to you are honest. So if we look at it from a different perspective, from a different relationship, we could also say, for example, if your partner is engaged, let's say you have an argument with your partner, and the goal here, process-oriented, right? This is competent communication. Competent means we're operating at a really high level. So I'm having a discussion with my partner. So you're having a discussion with your partner, your husband, your wife, your spouse, your whatever the case is. You're engaged in this discussion with your significant other, and so in this discussion, it's based around the fact that you all have engaged in some sort of argument, right? And so the goal is, remember, it's mutual satisfaction. The goal is, at the end of this discussion that we're going to have, we're going to come to some kind of understanding, and maybe you will understand why I feel the way I feel, and then I will understand the way you feel the way you feel. But if we're going to do this in a very legitimate way, right, and have it be a legitimate process, then one of the things that we're going to do is we can't lie. We're going to have to be honest. We're going to have to put everything on the table, and that's where the whole idea of values and ethics comes in. I can't give you some of the information, and then 6 weeks after we realize, well, okay, I didn't completely tell the truth, because then all that erodes trust, and then that's going to be a problem in the relationship. So when we're communicating, whether it's at work or whether it's a significant other or whatever the case is, one of the things about competent communication has got to have honesty in it. People have got to be honest, and that's where values and ethics comes in. All right, let's move on. So another thing is with competent communication is that it must be appropriate and effective. Competent communication has to be appropriate and effective. So there's this whole idea of behavioral flexibility, all right? Appropriate and effective, let me sum it up by this. There's a time and place for everything. All right, so let's discuss the other part of competent communication, and that has to do with it has to be appropriate and effective. So when we engage in communication, we've got to take into consideration: is it appropriate, and is it going to be effective? Now, the appropriate way to dress to go to an interview, someone will tell you, is to dress professionally. If you dress professionally, then it helps you to be effective in terms of people think that you're actually taking it seriously in terms of how you look at the job, right? And so that you actually took the time to dress up for the job. You took a shower, shaved, blah, 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 all that type of stuff, right? But keep in mind also that being appropriate doesn't mean that you're going to be effective, right? Being appropriate does not mean that you're going to be effective. So there's something called behavioral flexibility, and behavioral flexibility means basically that we're able to change or adapt our behavior, or whatever the case is, or maybe change our behavior depending on the circumstances and the situation. So when the situation arises, that we're able to adapt, we're able to change our behavior, talk differently, or dress differently or whatever, depending on the occasion, depending on the context of the situation. One thing in communication is context. Context matters beyond, above, and beyond a lot of other things. Context does matter. So if the context is a job interview, then if the context of the situation is a job interview, then you have to dress like you're trying to get the job. As people say, not like you already have the job, but dress like you're trying to get the job. Because remember, your goal, if we go all the way back, your goal is to get the job. So behavioral flexibility, you change your behavior depending on the circumstances of the situation. So I might talk more formally depending on where I am or who I'm with, and I might use more slang or more a certain type of dialect, or completely change my language and vocabulary, or whatever the case is, depending on who I'm having a conversation with. And also in terms of the way we dress as well. Keep in mind that communication is not only verbal, it's also nonverbal. All right, we'll talk more about verbal and nonverbal communication in subsequent discussions. All right, so continuing with competent communication. Competent communication is also tied to well-developed communication skills. So it's tied to well-developed communication skills, which means that we're going to observe certain social norms. Excuse me, thank you, pardon me, whatever the case is. Those are general social norms. Shaking someone's hand, saying good morning, good afternoon, whatever the case is. So competent communication is tied to well-developed communication skills. It also has a lot to do with technology. Technology seems like it's been around forever. It's been long, but really not that long in terms of us using technology such as text messages and Skype and Zoom and all these different things that we use to be able to communicate with people, and FaceTime and all that type of stuff. New forms of communication. So again, what type of channel are you going to use has a lot to do with the message that you're trying to get across. And we see a lot of people run into trouble with this, right? Using social media and putting certain things on social media that perhaps should not be in social media. Maybe it wasn't the appropriate channel to use to get a certain message across, a certain type of social media, or maybe social media was not the best form to use at all to be able to get that point across, that message across. So we also got to be able to look at the way we use technology and what is the most appropriate form of technology to use. Certainly, you probably wouldn't use technology to fire someone, right? Maybe that's something you have a face-to-face discussion with or something like that. But we can use technology to interview people now, especially in the time that we're living in with COVID and stuff like that, and not being able to maybe have certain types of close interactions with people. All right, so let's discuss now. Earlier I mentioned three models. The first of those models is the linear model. Now, the linear model takes into consideration that you have, and linear is Linear, linear model, takes into consideration that we have a sender and you have a receiver or some receivers. Now, there's no feedback in this model. It's just one person talking to another person or to a group of people. So the channel, let's say the channel is face to face, right? And so you have someone who's standing in front of you or a group of people and talking to you, but you're not saying anything in return. So the only thing you're doing is you are encoding, you are decoding, that person's encoding because the message begins with them, and they're using, say, face-to-face communication with you, and you are decoding in terms of you're interpreting, you're trying to make sense of the message that that person is trying to get you to understand. So there's no feedback in the linear model. You're just listening and trying to understand what the person's saying. Now, there are a couple things that could be causing noise in this sense. And when you think of noise, noise is anything that gets in the way of you understanding what the sender is trying to say. So it could be the person is using vocabulary that you don't understand. It could be that they are talking in such a way, not projecting properly, or whatever the case is. It could be a language barrier type of situation, a different dialect, or whatever the case is, could be noise. Just keep in mind, noise is anything that gets in the way of the I guess you could say the receiver not being able to understand, or receivers not being able to understand the message that is coming from the sender, right? And that is the linear model. The next model is the interaction model. Now, the difference here is that there's feedback. So when the receiver or receivers receive the message, they're able to turn back and say, well, I don't understand what you're saying. Or could you please clarify what you're saying? So the difference in the interaction model is there's interaction. People are going back and forth. So if the message starts with me, I encode. When you receive the message, you decode. If you don't understand what I'm saying, you turn around and you encode, and it comes back to me and I decode, and we go back and forth until we're on hopefully the same page. Now the back and forth is the feedback. The noise again that could happen in there is that anything that distracts, anything that takes away from us understanding each other. Again, it could be a vocabulary situation where one person is using words and the other person doesn't understand, jargon specific to a certain type of industry, and the other person doesn't know that language. It's not words or language that they use on an everyday basis, and so that might prevent the person from prevent them from understanding each other. So anything that prevents that understanding of the message between both parties is considered noise. So in the interaction model, there is feedback. All right, the final model is considered the competent communication model, right? So there's feedback going back and forth, but the competent communication model says that we've got to take a couple things into consideration. We have to take into consideration what is the relationship between both parties. So what's the relational context between both parties? What's their relationship? If, depending on the relationship I have with you, I may listen to you more, I may not listen to you at all. So what's the relationship context? What is the situation context? What has happened? And then how might it provoke a similar or different response between both of us? And then what's the cultural context? Are we from different cultures, for example? And so do we come at this situation that occurred differently because we're from a different culture, because we come from a different background, a different belief type of situation? So why is it that I see it this way and you see it that way? And all things being considered, it's the same situation we're looking at. And a lot of times that has to do with the cultural context. People seeing things differently. And we have lots of examples of that in society. I mean, if we look at the examples now, we have marches and stuff in the street, and if you look at, there's so many surveys in terms of how people understand and look at police brutality and all that type of stuff. And why is it that some people see it this way, and some people don't see it that way. And a lot of times it has to do with, if you're not a member of a certain group, of a certain culture, if you weren't brought up in a certain way, if you have not been exposed to many of the same types of things, it's very difficult to see and understand and appreciate what someone else is seeing, because you've never walked and in their footsteps, you've never walked in their shoes, you've never seen life from that person's perspective. And so that has a lot to do now with why both of us are going to see a similar situation in a completely different way. Now, one of the driving forces of competent communication is cognition. It is our ability to really reason, to think, to engage in communication, conversation with others, to want to learn, right? To want to engage in those conversations, to want to listen, to want to experience, while we may never completely understand the culture, but to at least want to be able to put ourselves in a situation where we could appreciate and respect what someone else might be saying, to attempt to understand another person's perspective. And a lot of that has to do with cognition. It has to do with our ability to be able to reason, to be able to logically think about things, to want to be able to engage in those things first of all, and then to also think about what we say before we say it, right? And recognizing that when we think about communication, we got to think about it in the context that it is irreversible. So when we say something, we cannot take it back. When we post something online, we can't take it back. We might run to try to retrieve it, or delete it, or whatever the case is. But by then, how many people have already passed it on, or whatever the case is. So competent communication does take those things into consideration. Cultural context, situational context, relational context. What is the relationship between me and the person that I'm engaging in communication with, as we're wrestling with this situation? And the way we see this situation, is it now going to be influenced by the fact that maybe we come from a different cultural mindset in terms of how we see whatever it is that's going on? And now we have to take that into consideration. Cognitive, we've got to think about how we process things, how we say things, how we speak to each other, and all that type of stuff, tone of voice and all that, which I would discuss in a subsequent discussion. So the basic study of communication looks at the communication processes, which I've started to look at, and we'll continue to look at it more in more detail as we go along in the subsequent videos that I would be uploading. And looking at interpersonal communication, right? Looking at communication across different individuals, across groups, and all that type of stuff, between people, interpersonal communication. Group and organizational communication, public speaking and mass communication, all of those have to do with the study of communication. So just as I close, just keep in mind that there's a saying that we cannot not communicate. Everything we do, we're engaging in communication. We cannot not communicate. So we're constantly always engaging in communication. And I've just touched on some of the basics, and I'm looking forward to digging a little bit deeper as I go on. And so thank you very much. Please leave your comments and I'll respond to your comments if you've got any questions in terms of what was discussed, and I'll try to, if they won't discussed to an extent to which you kind of got it the first time, I'll respond to your questions below. So please leave some feedback, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much. Bye.